The World War II, battles that were deliberately hidden from history. Everyone knows the names: Normandy, Stalingrad, Pearl Harbor. Their stories have been told for generations. They appear in documentaries, textbooks, movies, and memorials. They have become symbols of World War II itself. But what if some of the war's most important battles are not the ones you recognize? What if entire campaigns that changed the course of the conflict were quietly pushed into the shadows? Battles where tens of thousands died, battles that altered military strategies, influenced world leaders, and reshaped entire fronts. Battles whose consequences echoed across continents. And yet, today, almost nobody remembers them. This is one of the strangest contradictions in modern history. World War II is the most documented conflict ever fought. Millions of pages of reports survive. Thousands of photographs exist. Countless witnesses recorded their experiences. Historians have spent decades studying every major decision, every offensive, every turning point. So how can battles that helped shape the outcome of the war virtually disappear from public memory? The answer is more complicated than simple forgetfulness. History is often described as being written by the victors, but that phrase tells only part of the story. History is also edited. Governments edit history. Military leaders edit history. Political interests edit history. National myths edit history. After wars end, nations begin constructing narratives. Heroes are celebrated. Triumphs are remembered. Sacrifices are honored. Yet some events create uncomfortable questions. Some expose catastrophic failures. Some reveal political betrayals. Some challenge the stories countries want future generations to believe. And when that happens, memory becomes selective. A battle does not need to disappear completely to be forgotten. Sometimes it is enough to remove it from documentaries, to reduce it to a footnote, to overshadow it with larger events, to shift attention elsewhere. Over time, silence can become more powerful than censorship. Imagine being a soldier who survived one of these forgotten battlefields. You watched friends die. You endured impossible conditions. You witnessed decisions that determined the fate of thousands. You believed history would remember what happened there. Then decades pass. The battle fades from public discussion. The names vanish from classrooms. The sacrifice becomes invisible. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and remote corners of the world, there are battlefields where this happened. Places where history took a different path than the one most people know. Some were hidden because they exposed military incompetence. Some because they embarrassed powerful governments. Some because they complicated the official story of who the heroes and villains were. Others disappeared because acknowledging them would force nations to confront truths they preferred to leave buried. Tonight, we are going to uncover those forgotten battlefields. Not the famous victories, not the legendary campaigns. The battles that somehow slipped through the cracks of collective memory. One by one, we will follow the evidence, uncover the decisions, expose the failures, and reveal the hidden patterns connecting them all. Because as this investigation unfolds, an unsettling possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps the greatest mystery of World War II is not what happened on the battlefields everyone remembers. Perhaps it is what happened on the battlefields the world was encouraged to forget. The battle too embarrassing to remember. The road to Rzhev was lined with burned villages, shattered forests, and endless fields scarred by artillery craters. In 1942, while much of the world's attention focused on the titanic struggle unfolding farther south toward Stalingrad, another battle was consuming entire armies west of Moscow. It lacked the symbolism of a capital city under siege and the drama of a final stand beside a famous river. Yet the fighting around Rzhev would become one of the bloodiest and most costly campaigns of the entire war. Today, despite its enormous significance, its name rarely appears outside specialist history books. That silence is not accidental. Rzhev exposed failures that powerful men preferred history to forget. The Soviet leadership entered the campaign with confidence. Germany had failed to capture Moscow during the winter of 1941. For the first time, many believed the Red Army had seized the initiative. Soviet commanders saw the massive German position near Rzhev as a dangerous threat hanging over the capital. Destroying it promised not only military security, but also a powerful political victory. Orders were issued. Offensive plans were approved. Expectations soared. On maps inside command headquarters, the operation appeared straightforward. Break through the German lines, surround the enemy, and eliminate the salient. Reality would prove far different. As Soviet troops advanced, they encountered a defensive system far stronger than intelligence reports had suggested. German forces occupied fortified positions protected by minefields, artillery batteries, hidden bunkers, and overlapping machine gun fire. Entire Soviet formations found themselves advancing across exposed terrain with little cover. Men disappeared beneath artillery barrages before reaching enemy lines. Tanks became trapped in mud and forested bottlenecks. Communications failed. Units lost contact with neighboring formations. Yet the attacks continued. Commanders far from the front demanded progress, and every failed assault was often followed by another. For the soldiers fighting there, Rzhev became something far more terrifying than a military objective. It became a machine that consumed human lives. Veterans later described endless waves of attacks, frozen nights surrounded by the wounded, and battlefields littered with bodies that could not be recovered. Entire regiments were reduced to fragments. Reinforcements arrived only to be thrown into the same deadly cycle. The suffering was so immense that survivors gave the campaign a chilling name: the meat grinder. It was not a phrase created by historians decades later. It came directly from men who had witnessed the horror firsthand. What made the disaster especially uncomfortable for Soviet authorities was that courage was never the problem. The soldiers fought with extraordinary determination. The deeper issue was the decision-making behind the campaign itself. Strategic optimism repeatedly collided with battlefield reality. Political pressure encouraged offensives even when conditions were unfavorable. Casualties mounted on a scale that became increasingly difficult to justify. Acknowledging these mistakes during wartime risked undermining morale and confidence in military leadership. As a result, the true story of Rzhev remained overshadowed by later victories that offered more inspiring narratives. When the war finally ended, history naturally gravitated toward triumphs. Stalingrad became the symbol of Soviet resilience. Kursk became the symbol of Soviet dominance. Berlin became the symbol of final victory. Rzhev fit none of these categories. It raised uncomfortable questions about leadership, planning, and the price paid for strategic lessons. The battle had influenced the evolution of Soviet military operations, but it did so through failure rather than glory. For decades, its memory remained buried beneath more convenient stories. Yet Rzhev reveals something essential about how history is remembered. Some battles disappear not because they were unimportant, but because they expose truths that challenge national myths. The greater the embarrassment, the stronger the temptation to look away. And if a disastrous defeat could be pushed into the shadows, an even stranger mystery awaits us next. What happens when a battle ends in victory? But the truth behind that victory is so disturbing that governments would rather people never talk about it at all. The victory nobody wanted to celebrate. In the summer of 1943, the world witnessed one of the greatest turning points of World War II. The German offensive at Kursk had failed, and the Red Army was preparing to seize the strategic initiative for the remainder of the war. History remembers the massive tank battles, the collapse of Hitler's hopes in the East, and the beginning of an unstoppable Soviet advance. Yet hidden behind these famous events was another victory, one that should have become a symbol of triumph, but instead slipped into relative obscurity. It was the Soviet offensive known as Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev, the campaign that recaptured the city of Kharkov. The operation succeeded. The city was liberated. The Germans were pushed back. Yet the story surrounding that victory revealed realities few leaders wanted publicly examined. The offensive began with enormous momentum. Soviet commanders had learned painful lessons from earlier failures, including disasters like Rzhev. This time, planning was more sophisticated, coordination was stronger, and the Red Army possessed overwhelming resources. As thousands of guns opened fire and armored formations surged forward, it seemed that Soviet military power had finally matured into a force capable of matching and defeating Germany's best armies. Newspapers celebrated the advance. Official reports highlighted success. To ordinary citizens, Kharkov appeared to be proof that victory was approaching. But beneath the celebration lay a darker reality. The victory came at an astonishing cost. Soviet commanders achieved their objectives through relentless pressure, accepting casualties that would shock later generations. Entire units were consumed in repeated assaults. Streets became killing grounds. Villages changed hands multiple times in a single day. The offensive demonstrated the growing strength of the Soviet war machine, but it also revealed how willing military leaders remained to spend human lives in pursuit of operational success. The official narrative emphasized liberation and progress. It spoke far less about the thousands who disappeared into the smoke of that advance. The situation became even more complicated after the city was retaken. Kharkov had already endured multiple occupations during the war. Its population had suffered under both military rule and constant combat. The liberation exposed evidence of atrocities committed by German occupation authorities, but it also revealed the complexity of a city that had survived years of shifting control, collaboration, resistance, and fear. These realities did not fit neatly into wartime propaganda. Governments preferred stories with clear heroes and villains. Kharkov's experience was far messier. The truth resisted simplification. Military historians today often focus on the strategic brilliance of the campaign. They examine operational planning, armored maneuvers, and command decisions. Yet the political dimension remains equally important. Soviet authorities wanted victories that inspired confidence and reinforced national unity. Detailed discussions about enormous casualties or uncomfortable social realities risked distracting from that message. As a result, Kharkov became known primarily as another step toward Berlin, rather than as a complex battlefield that revealed the true cost of liberation. The victory remained visible, but many of its most difficult lessons faded into the background. This is one of history's strangest patterns. We often assume that winning guarantees remembrance. In reality, victories can be hidden almost as effectively as defeats. Sometimes governments fear what a triumph reveals. Sometimes the cost of success becomes too disturbing. Sometimes the human suffering behind a military achievement threatens the very narrative leaders hope to promote. In those cases, the battle survives in history, but only in a carefully edited form. The recapture of Kharkov reminds us that memory is selective. Nations celebrate results while quietly minimizing uncomfortable details. Yet even this example pales beside what happens when politics enters the battlefield itself. Because the next forgotten chapter is not simply about soldiers fighting an enemy, it is about allies pursuing different agendas, competing for influence, and shaping history according to their own interests. And when allies begin rewriting the same story for different reasons, the truth can become one of the first casualties of victory. The battlefield caught between allies. In September 1944, the guns were not only aimed at the enemy. Hidden beneath the surface of the war, another struggle was taking shape. It was a conflict of ambitions, influence, and competing visions for post-war Europe. The battlefield was Warsaw, the capital of Poland. Officially, the Allied powers were united against Nazi Germany. In reality, as the war approached its final phase, cracks were beginning to appear within that alliance. The Warsaw Uprising would expose those fractures in a way that few battles ever had, transforming a desperate fight for freedom into one of the most politically complicated episodes of World War II. When the uprising began, the Polish Home Army believed the moment had arrived. German forces were retreating across Eastern Europe, and Soviet troops were advancing rapidly toward the city. Polish resistance leaders launched an operation designed to liberate Warsaw before the arrival of the Red Army. Their goal was clear. They wanted a free Poland to emerge from the ruins, governed by Poles rather than controlled by any foreign power. Thousands of resistance fighters, many poorly armed, emerged from hiding and attacked German positions throughout the city. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that they might succeed. Then the advance of the Soviet army slowed. Across the Vistula River, Soviet forces halted while fierce fighting continued inside Warsaw. Day after day, the resistance expected assistance that never arrived in the form they had hoped. German reinforcements poured into the city. Entire neighborhoods were subjected to systematic destruction. Civilians found themselves trapped between two of the most powerful military forces on Earth. The uprising became a brutal urban battle fought street by street, building by building, cellar by cellar. Every block captured came at a terrible price. The military disaster that followed was accompanied by a political one. The Polish resistance viewed itself as the legitimate representative of the nation's future. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin viewed many of those same resistance fighters as potential obstacles to Soviet influence after the war. This created an uncomfortable reality that Allied governments struggled to address openly. Britain and the United States supported Poland, yet they depended on cooperation with the Soviet Union to defeat Germany. Publicly confronting Stalin carried enormous strategic risks. As a result, diplomacy, military necessity, and political calculation collided while Warsaw burned. For the civilians inside the city, those geopolitical calculations offered little comfort. Food supplies vanished, hospitals overflowed, entire districts were reduced to rubble. German forces carried out mass executions and systematic destruction on a scale that shocked even experienced observers. By the time the uprising collapsed after more than 2 months of fighting, much of Warsaw had been devastated. Tens of thousands were dead. The city itself had become a symbol of sacrifice, courage, and abandonment all at once. After the war, the memory of Warsaw became entangled in competing narratives. Different governments emphasized different aspects of the story. Some highlighted heroism. Others focused on military realities. Certain political questions were discussed openly, while others remained sensitive for decades. The result was that one of the most significant urban battles of the war became known through fragmented versions of its history. The battlefield itself had become a victim of political interpretation. Even among the victorious Allies, agreement on what Warsaw truly represented proved elusive. The Warsaw Uprising reveals a disturbing truth about historical memory. Battles are not always forgotten because nobody remembers them. Sometimes they become trapped between competing versions of remembrance. The facts survive, but the deeper meaning becomes obscured beneath layers of politics, diplomacy, and national interest. Yet even the tragedy of Warsaw is not the darkest example of history's selective memory. Because some people were not merely caught between rival narratives, they were pushed out of them entirely. Their bravery was undeniable, their sacrifices were immense, but their existence challenged the stories nations wanted to tell. And that is where our next forgotten battlefield begins, the soldiers who became inconvenient witnesses. On the beaches of southern France, in the deserts of North Africa, across the mountains of Italy, and deep within the jungles of Southeast Asia, hundreds of thousands of men fought under flags that were not truly their own. They marched into battle, wearing the uniforms of empires, serving nations that often viewed them as subjects rather than equals. They faced machine gun fire, artillery barrages, starvation, disease, and death. They helped win World War II. Yet when the war ended and nations began writing their stories of victory, many of these soldiers found themselves pushed to the margins of history. Their service was real, their sacrifices were undeniable, but their existence complicated the narratives that emerged after the conflict. Among the most striking examples were the colonial troops recruited from Africa, soldiers from Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Senegal, and other territories fought alongside French forces throughout some of the war's most critical campaigns. During the liberation of France, these troops played essential roles in operations that helped drive German forces back across Europe. They stormed beaches, captured strategic positions, and endured the same dangers as every other soldier on the battlefield. Yet as liberation progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The public image of the liberating armies increasingly emphasized European faces, while the contributions of many colonial units faded into the background. The reasons were deeply political. Post-war governments sought to rebuild national pride and unity. The image of a liberated nation often centered on narratives that were easier to celebrate and control. Acknowledging the full extent of colonial participation raised uncomfortable questions about empire, citizenship, race, and equality. For many veterans, the war ended with an unsettling realization. They had risked everything to defeat one form of oppression, only to return to societies where they remained marginalized. Some waited years for recognition. Others never received it at all. A similar pattern emerged elsewhere. Across Eastern Europe, resistance fighters who had battled Nazi occupation discovered that political realities could transform heroes into liabilities almost overnight. Some groups that fought courageously against Germany later found themselves viewed with suspicion by new governments. Their wartime contributions were minimized, distorted, or ignored because they did not fit the political priorities of the post-war world. The battlefield had ended, but another struggle had begun: the battle over memory itself. What makes these stories especially powerful is their deeply human dimension. Unlike generals and politicians, these soldiers rarely shaped grand strategy. They did not decide alliances or negotiate treaties. They carried rifles, followed orders, and endured hardships few people today can imagine. Many believed their sacrifices would earn a permanent place in history. Instead, they became inconvenient witnesses to truths that complicated national myths. Their experiences revealed that victory was often built upon contributions far more diverse than official narratives suggested. For decades, countless photographs remained buried in archives. Personal testimonies received little attention. Family histories survived in private conversations rather than public commemorations. Entire generations grew up unaware that men from distant colonies, occupied nations, and forgotten resistance movements had helped determine the outcome of the war. Their absence from mainstream memory was not always the result of deliberate censorship. Sometimes it emerged from quieter forces: political convenience, selective storytelling, and the natural tendency of nations to simplify complex histories. Yet even these forgotten soldiers left traces behind. Their stories continue to surface through letters, diaries, interviews, and newly examined records. Each discovery challenges the comfortable version of history many people inherited. Each recovered voice reminds us that wars are not won solely by the figures who appear in monuments and textbooks. They are also won by people whose names were never intended to be remembered. And as remarkable as their stories are, they still existed within battles that eventually became known to historians. The next chapter takes us somewhere even deeper into the shadows, into a conflict where secrecy itself became a weapon, and where some of the most important battles were hidden not for years, but for generations. The battle that exposed a secret war. On a map, it looked insignificant. A remote stretch of coastline battered by wind, rain, and the relentless waves of the North Atlantic. No famous capital stood nearby. No vast armored armies clashed across open plains. Yet beneath the surface of these cold waters, one of the most secretive battles of World War II was unfolding. It was a conflict fought not for territory, but for information. Not for cities, but for secrets. And for years, much of what happened there remained hidden from the public. This was the shadow war of the Atlantic, where intelligence, deception, and code-breaking became as powerful as battleships and bombers. Throughout the war, German U-boats stalked Allied shipping routes, threatening to sever the lifeline connecting North America to Britain. Food, fuel, weapons, and reinforcements all depended on these convoys crossing the ocean. Every ship sunk brought Britain closer to isolation. Every convoy lost strengthened Germany's position. To most observers, the struggle appeared to be a straightforward naval campaign. Merchant ships attempted to survive, while submarines hunted them across vast expanses of ocean. But behind the scenes, another battle was taking place, one that neither side could openly acknowledge. At the center of this hidden conflict was intelligence gathered through one of the greatest secrets of the war: the breaking of German encrypted communications. At facilities hidden far from the front lines, mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and analysts worked tirelessly to unlock messages transmitted between German naval commanders and their submarines. The information they uncovered often provided extraordinary advantages. Convoys could be redirected. Ambushes could be avoided. Naval forces could be positioned with remarkable precision. Yet using this intelligence created a dangerous dilemma. If Germany discovered its codes had been compromised, the advantage could disappear overnight. This led to extraordinary decisions. Allied commanders occasionally allowed certain operations to proceed without interference. Some ships sailed into danger without knowing the full extent of the threat. Some opportunities to destroy enemy forces were ignored. Protecting the secret sometimes mattered more than achieving immediate tactical success. To those directly involved, the situation was agonizing. Lives were being risked to preserve an intelligence advantage that might ultimately save far more lives in the future. It was a form of warfare that existed almost entirely beyond public view. The secrecy surrounding these operations survived long after the guns fell silent. Millions celebrated victory in 1945 without understanding how deeply intelligence had shaped the outcome of the war. The men and women who worked in code-breaking facilities were sworn to silence. Naval officers rarely discussed the true reasons behind their decisions. Historians examining wartime records often encountered gaps that made little sense. Entire chapters of the conflict remained hidden because revealing them would expose methods and capabilities governments still considered sensitive. What makes this story so remarkable is that the hidden war often influenced the visible one. Battles at sea, convoy routes, and strategic decisions were frequently shaped by information unavailable to the public. Many apparent coincidences were not coincidences at all. Successes that seemed miraculous often rested on intelligence carefully concealed from friend and foe alike. The war people witnessed was only part of the war that was actually being fought. Over time, fragments of the truth emerged. Declassified documents revealed how deeply intelligence operations had penetrated German communications. Historians began reconstructing the hidden battles that unfolded behind official narratives. Yet even today, the full picture remains incomplete. Some records were destroyed. Some details remain disputed. Some questions continue to provoke debate among scholars. The deeper researchers dig into the secret war, the more they discover how much remained concealed for decades. And that realization leads directly to another mystery. Not every forgotten battlefield was hidden by secrecy or politics. Some vanished simply because of where they were located. Entire campaigns involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers occurred far from Europe and far from the front lines that dominate popular memory. They unfolded in regions many people rarely associate with World War II at all. And despite their enormous scale, they became some of the most overlooked battlefields of the entire conflict. The front, the world forgot. When most people picture World War II, they imagine the beaches of Normandy, the ruins of Stalingrad, the skies above Britain, or the islands of the Pacific. Maps in documentaries often draw the viewer's attention toward Europe and the dramatic clashes between Germany and the Soviet Union. Yet, thousands of miles away from those famous battlefields, Another front consumed vast armies, reshaped empires, and claimed millions of lives. It stretched across dense jungles, towering mountains, flooded valleys, and some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Despite its scale and significance, it remains one of the least remembered theaters of the war, the China-Burma-India front. By the early 1940s, China had already been fighting Japan for years, before many Western nations fully entered the conflict. Entire cities had been devastated, millions of civilians had been displaced, enormous armies were locked in a struggle that stretched across vast distances. When the war expanded into Burma and threatened British India, the conflict transformed into a campaign of extraordinary strategic importance. Control of supply routes, transportation corridors, and access to China suddenly became critical to the broader Allied war effort. Yet because the fighting occurred far from Europe, it rarely occupied the same place in public consciousness. The battlefields themselves presented challenges unlike anything faced elsewhere. Soldiers marched through suffocating jungles where visibility could shrink to only a few meters. Monsoon rains turned roads into rivers of mud. Disease often proved as deadly as enemy fire. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion devastated entire units. Supplies had to be carried over mountains, flown across dangerous air routes, or transported through terrain that seemed designed to defeat modern armies. Every mile gained came at an extraordinary cost. Victory depended not only on military skill, but also on the ability to survive the environment itself. One of the most remarkable examples emerged during the fighting around northern Burma. Allied and Chinese forces launched complex operations aimed at reopening land routes into China and weakening Japanese control of the region. The battles involved multinational armies, competing strategic priorities, and some of the most difficult logistical challenges of the entire war. Soldiers fought through dense jungle, while engineers carved roads through mountains once considered impassable. Entire campaigns unfolded in conditions that many commanders had initially believed impossible to overcome. Yet despite their significance, these operations rarely appear alongside the better-known battles that dominate historical memory. Part of the reason lies in geography. Historical memory often gravitates toward places that later became symbols of political transformation. Berlin represented the fall of Nazi Germany. Normandy symbolized liberation. Hiroshima symbolized the dawn of the nuclear age. The China-Burma-India theater lacked a single defining moment that could easily encapsulate its importance. Its story was spread across thousands of miles and countless interconnected operations. As a result, its achievements were often fragmented into separate narratives, making it easier for the entire theater to fade from public attention. Another factor was the post-war world itself. After 1945, global politics shifted rapidly. New conflicts emerged. Former allies became rivals. Decolonization transformed empires. Civil wars reshaped entire regions. In the midst of these dramatic changes, the memory of campaigns fought in remote jungles and mountains received less attention than events tied directly to the emerging Cold War order. The front had not been insignificant. It had simply become overshadowed by the geopolitical realities that followed. Yet the forgotten nature of this theater reveals something profound about how history works. Memory is often influenced not only by what happened, but by where it happened. Entire armies can fight and die in campaigns that later generations barely recognize simply because those battlefields lie outside the familiar map of popular history. The China-Burma-India front was not a side story. It was a crucial part of the global conflict. Its obscurity tells us as much about historical memory as it does about the war itself. But even these neglected campaigns were not completely erased. Records survived. Veterans told their stories. Historians eventually rediscovered their importance. The next battlefield is different. Its disappearance was far less accidental. It challenged a nation's preferred image of itself, exposed uncomfortable truths about leadership and decision-making, and became a reminder that some histories are not forgotten because they are distant. They are forgotten because remembering them is deeply inconvenient. The battle that threatened a national myth. Every nation builds stories about itself, stories of courage, resilience, sacrifice, and triumph. These narratives help explain the past and inspire future generations. But sometimes a battlefield emerges that does not fit comfortably within those stories. Sometimes the facts challenge the image a country wants to project to the world and to itself. During World War II, few battles created this kind of discomfort more powerfully than the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. For the United States, it was a painful confrontation that exposed weaknesses many preferred to forget. It was not merely a military setback. It was a direct challenge to the myth of preparedness and competence that often surrounds America's role in the war. In early 1943, American forces were still relatively new to large-scale combat against experienced German troops. Many soldiers were brave, motivated, and eager to prove themselves. What they lacked was battlefield experience. Across the rugged terrain of North Africa, they found themselves facing seasoned German formations, commanded by some of the most capable officers in the Wehrmacht. Among them was the legendary German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, whose reputation alone carried enormous psychological weight. When the confrontation began, American commanders believed they could hold their positions. They quickly discovered how unprepared they truly were. The attack unfolded with alarming speed. German armored units exploited weaknesses in American defenses, penetrating positions that had been poorly coordinated and inadequately protected. Communication failures multiplied confusion. Units became isolated. Orders arrived too late or not at all. Entire formations retreated under intense pressure. The battlefield descended into chaos as inexperienced commanders struggled to respond to rapidly changing conditions. For many American soldiers, Kasserine was their first encounter with the brutal realities of modern mechanized warfare. The lessons were harsh, immediate, and unforgettable. What made the battle especially uncomfortable was that the failures could not be blamed solely on enemy strength. Investigations after the fighting revealed serious problems in leadership, planning, training, and command structure. Some officers proved unable to adapt under pressure. Strategic decisions made far from the front contributed to the confusion on the ground. The defeat forced military leaders to confront weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. If the United States hoped to defeat Germany, fundamental changes would be necessary. The battle exposed flaws that official narratives rarely emphasize when discussing America's eventual victory. Yet Kasserine also reveals why history is often more complicated than national myths allow. The same battle that exposed failure also became the catalyst for transformation. Command structures were reorganized, training methods improved, tactical doctrines evolved. Officers who struggled were replaced by leaders better suited to modern warfare. The defeat became one of the most important learning experiences of the entire American war effort. In many ways, the road to later victories in Europe passed directly through the hard lessons of North Africa. But because the battle contradicted the image of steady progress and inevitable success, it rarely occupies the same place in public memory as the triumphs that followed. This pattern appears throughout history. Nations celebrate victories because victories reinforce identity. Defeats, especially those caused by internal failures, are far more difficult to integrate into a heroic narrative. Over time, public attention naturally gravitates toward moments of success. The battles that reveal vulnerability often fade into the background. They remain known to historians and military professionals, yet they rarely become central parts of popular memory. The result is a version of history that feels complete while leaving some of its most important lessons hidden beneath the surface. Kasserine Pass forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Great powers are not weakened by acknowledging mistakes. They are strengthened by learning from them. The battle's true significance lies not in the defeat itself, but in what it revealed about leadership, adaptation, and the cost of complacency. It stands as a reminder that national myths often simplify events that were far more complex, far more human, and far more instructive than later generations realize. And yet, even Kasserine is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Across every forgotten battlefield we have explored, certain patterns continue to appear. Different countries, different armies, different circumstances. Yet the same forces seem to shape what is remembered and what is pushed into the shadows. Political interests, embarrassment, competing narratives, strategic secrecy. As our investigation approaches its conclusion, one final question remains. Were these battles forgotten independently, or were they all connected by something deeper? The pattern hidden across every forgotten battlefield. At first glance, the battlefields we have explored seem to have little in common. Rzhev was a disaster born from costly military decisions. Kharkov was a victory clouded by uncomfortable realities. Warsaw became trapped between competing political agendas. Colonial soldiers were pushed aside by post-war narratives. The secret war of intelligence remained hidden behind classified operations. The China-Burma-India front faded into obscurity because of geography and shifting global priorities. Kasserine Pass challenged a national image built around eventual triumph. Different continents, different armies, different outcomes, different circumstances. Yet when these stories are placed side by side, a pattern begins to emerge. The first element of that pattern is embarrassment. Governments can proudly display victories. They can commemorate heroism. They can celebrate sacrifice. What becomes far more difficult is publicly confronting failures that expose poor leadership, flawed planning, or avoidable mistakes. The Battle of Rzhev revealed the deadly consequences of unrealistic expectations. Kasserine Pass exposed weaknesses inside an army that would later become one of the most powerful military forces in history. Neither battle disappeared completely, but neither received the same attention as events that reinforced more favorable narratives. History remembered them selectively. The second element is political convenience. Wars do not end when the shooting stops. After military conflict comes the struggle to shape memory. The Warsaw Uprising became entangled in the political realities of post-war Europe. Colonial troops who helped secure victory complicated discussions about empire and equality. Governments constructing national identities often prefer stories that unite rather than divide. The result is not always direct censorship. More often, it is a gradual process of emphasis and omission. Some stories are highlighted. Others quietly recede into the background until entire generations grow up unaware of their significance. The third element is secrecy. Throughout World War II, intelligence operations influenced decisions at the highest levels. Code-breaking, deception campaigns, covert missions, and classified programs helped determine the outcome of countless operations. Yet many of these activities remained hidden long after the war ended. Information that could reveal methods, capabilities, or strategic advantages was protected behind layers of secrecy. Historians attempting to reconstruct these events often discovered that entire chapters of the war had been deliberately concealed. The public witnessed the visible conflict while remaining unaware of the invisible one unfolding alongside it. Another recurring pattern involves geography itself. Certain battlefields become symbols. Others do not. Normandy evokes liberation. Stalingrad evokes resistance. Pearl Harbor evokes surprise and determination. But what about remote jungles in Burma? Forgotten valleys near Rzhev? Countless battlefields far from the locations that dominate popular memory? Historical attention tends to concentrate around symbolic places. Once those symbols become established, they attract books, films, documentaries, and educational focus. Other locations, regardless of their importance, struggle to compete. Geography influences memory more than most people realize. Yet perhaps the most powerful force shaping historical memory is the human desire for simple stories. The reality of war is chaotic, contradictory, and often morally uncomfortable. Nations prefer narratives with clear heroes and villains. They prefer victories that inspire, sacrifices that unite, and lessons that feel reassuring. Forgotten battlefields often resist those categories. They reveal ambiguity, they expose political compromises, they force difficult questions about leadership, responsibility, and truth. In doing so, they become harder to fit into the stories societies tell about themselves. This is why forgetting was never random. Across every battlefield we have examined, the same invisible forces appear again and again. Political embarrassment, failed leadership, conflicting narratives, post-war propaganda, national identity, classified operations. Together, they shaped not only how World War II was fought, but how it would later be remembered. And that realization brings us to the final and perhaps most important question of all. If history is shaped by those who record it, edit it, celebrate it, and sometimes suppress it, then who truly controls what future generations remember? The answer may reveal that the greatest mystery of World War II was never hidden in the battles themselves. It was hidden in the stories told about them afterward. Who controls history? The battlefields are silent now. The artillery has stopped. The tanks no longer advance. The cities that once burned beneath falling bombs have been rebuilt. Forests have reclaimed trenches. Roads now cross ground where entire armies once fought and died. Yet the silence left behind by World War II is not complete. Beneath the famous stories, beneath the monuments and commemorations, another history continues to exist. A history of forgotten campaigns, overlooked soldiers, hidden decisions, and uncomfortable truths. A history that survives not because it was widely remembered, but because fragments of it refused to disappear. Throughout this investigation, we have followed those fragments. We stood on the blood-soaked fields of Rzhev, where catastrophic decisions condemned countless soldiers to a battle many people have never heard of. We witnessed a victory at Kharkov that revealed realities governments preferred to keep in the shadows. We entered Warsaw, where political interests transformed a heroic struggle into one of the most contested memories of the war. We followed forgotten soldiers whose sacrifices helped secure victory, only to watch them disappear from the narratives built afterward. We uncovered a secret war fought through intelligence, deception, and information, hidden from public view for decades. We traveled to distant fronts where immense campaigns unfolded, far from the places history chose to spotlight. And we examined battles that challenged national myths, exposing weaknesses that later generations found easier to ignore than confront. Each story was different. Each battlefield was unique. Yet all of them pointed toward the same conclusion. The process of remembering is never neutral. History is not simply a collection of facts waiting to be discovered. It is a story constantly being organized, interpreted, emphasized, and sometimes reshaped. Certain events become symbols. Others become footnotes. Some names are repeated for generations. Others slowly fade from public consciousness. That does not necessarily require conspiracies. It does not always require censorship. Sometimes it happens through political priorities, sometimes through national pride, sometimes through the natural human tendency to simplify events that were far more complicated than we would like to admit. The result is that entire chapters of history can remain hidden in plain sight, not because the evidence disappeared, not because the battles never happened, but because attention moved elsewhere. And when attention disappears, memory often follows. This is why forgotten battlefields matter, not simply because they deserve recognition, not simply because the soldiers who fought there deserve remembrance. They matter because they remind us to question the stories we inherit, to look beyond the headlines of history, to examine the events that do not fit neatly into familiar narratives, to ask what has been left out and why. World War II remains the most studied conflict in human history. Millions of documents have been analyzed. Thousands of books have been written. Generations of historians have examined its causes, battles, leaders, and consequences. Yet even after all that research, hidden corners still exist. Forgotten battlefields still wait to be rediscovered. Uncomfortable truths still challenge accepted narratives. And that may be the most fascinating lesson of all. The greatest mystery of World War II is not what happened on the battlefields everyone remembers. It is what happened on the battlefields the world allowed itself to forget. Because in the end, history is shaped not only by those who fought the war, it is shaped by those who decide which stories survive. And somewhere beneath the forests, deserts, mountains, cities, and oceans where these forgotten battles were fought, the echoes remain, waiting for someone to listen.